right, and welcome to TrainWorld's Facebook Live, everyone, and good evening, and thank you for joining and tuning in. And we have another very special episode, one who has been on our show numerous times, but we will continue the DCC seminar series, and we have George Bogatuk from Soundtraxx. How you doing, George?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. How about yourself out there?
All right. Always good to have you.
Oh, it's always fun to be on here with you guys. And I'm always happy to help educate customers and teach them what's going on, because I know I've said this to you before, but years ago, when I was just a young kid, wet behind the ears, somebody had to teach me model railroading. That included track laying, that included bench work building, model or scenery, all that stuff. And so this is just one way that I can help repay that community that's given me so much. So I know it sounds cheesy, but it's actually very true.
Well, you're like the great DCC wizard. So we appreciate you coming on and teaching everyone, because trains is all about being fun and as a hobby. So George is a great tool and asset to get you kind of the started with tech questions. He's an expert, so he's got a lot of good stuff he's going to cover. Basically, we're going to talk about the basics of what it takes to install a DCC decoder into a model, and he's got numerous of other topics. What is DCC ready versus not DCC ready? How can we make a model DCC ready? What it takes to wire it in place, DCC decoder selection. We're going to talk about all the great Soundtraxx records, awards, and why buy the Soundtraxx decoders. And so we got an action-packed lineup tonight, and we're going to send George to take it away.
Well, Ken, we do have a lot. So first thing I'm going to tell everybody, don't worry. If you miss something, you can always go back and watch it. But ultimately, there's not going to be a test at the end. You don't have to pass a test to be able to get out of this. So what I want to do today is just kind of show you some basic information, some guidelines, things that you can kind of keep in mind when you're doing a decoder installation. And then we'll kind of cover some of our decoders and what the benefits are of each different board format and what the differences are. But Ken, one thing I want to point out really quickly, just you called me a DCC expert, and I want to make sure everybody knows I'm not an engineer. I'm just a dumb sales guy who happened to luck into a great position at a great company that I enjoy working for. I've been a model railroader since I was 14, and to kind of share a little bit with you, my first DCC system, when I bought it, it was probably around 2006, 2007, something like that, long before I had the name on my shirt. Actually, it's probably more like 2003. But anyway, the point was I got home, I sat down, I opened up the manual to start reading, and it made no sense. I had no idea what I was reading. It's very dry. It's difficult to read. And I'm not going to throw out the name brand right now because that's irrelevant. But I sat there and I looked at that and went, oh my God, what did I get myself into? And so I said, well, my stuff is working right now. I'm going to put this down and I'll deal with this later. 2 years went by. 2 years, and I started seeing more and more stuff about DCC and, decoder ready and all this stuff, and everything you could see the market shifting towards the DCC side of it versus all the proprietary command control stuff that was out there. And I thought to myself, you know what? I've already done the hard part. I spent the money already.
Right.
At that point, all I needed to do was just learn how to use it. So I sat down, opened it up, and actually read the manual, started reaching out to the manufacturer and asked questions and things like that. And basically I got to the point where, okay, I understand how this is working now. So I'm better equipped to be able to run my trains. And that's when I started really jumping into DCC. At that point, I took all the command control stuff I had in there, went and switched everything over to DCC. And about that time, it wasn't long after that Soundtraxx announced the first Tsunami decoders, which were about 2004, 2005.
Right.
And so I started converting everything to starting with sound, and then the diesels were 2008. So it really can be intimidating and daunting. And the reason I share that personal story is because, again, most of my training is my own personal reading and learning and actually using the product. When I got into Soundtraxx, I realized there's a ton of information that isn't shared with the general public. Most of the system manufacturers give you a system, they throw a manual at you and say, good luck. And it's up to you to kind of fend for yourself. And so from that perspective, again, being a model railroader myself, you know, I take the time to try to help show everybody what you can do with decoders, what you can do with the DCC systems. And we talked about this before. We have our own YouTube channel and we have a webinar series, and that's going to cover a lot of the how DCC works, even operation using some of the major systems out there. So you're really going to want to watch each of those episodes. They're about 30 to 40 minutes long, and they're going to give you a ton of information that isn't generally out there without having to read a big, thick, dry manual or all these other books that are written by third parties. And so, so I just want to tell everybody, be confident. Don't be afraid of it. Don't let the words intimidate you away from it. We're going to jump in with this. It's not as scary as it sounds. It's easier than it sounds. And then when it comes to decoder installation, which is our topic for today, we're going to show you kind of how a lot of the models are designed and built in such a way that you can now look at your model critically and see all the things we're going to talk about.
All right.
So,
all right, George.
Go ahead.
And don't downplay yourself. I'm still going to call you George the Great, the DCC Soundtraxx wizard.
That's okay.
But you know, I'm looking forward to listening to this and learning a few tips from you as well.
Okay. Well, great. I appreciate it. So anyway, so the first point of topic that we're going to talk about is the term DCC ready. And you see this in a lot of models, and then some of them are DCC equipped, some of them are DCC ready. What exactly does that mean? Well, the term DCC ready, by its original definition, was that the motor power wires were separated physically from the track power. So when we go back into the old days, we look at some of the old Athearn Blue Box, for example. We had and this is a broken down frame, but we're going to kind of show a little bit of it. But you basically had a truck that fit into the frame here, and the power was transferred physically from the truck to the frame, and then on the underside of the motor here was physically touching the frame down below, and that's how the power was transferred from one rail to the motor. And then on the top, there's another clip, and this clip then had a piece of metal that then went to a little bracket that I've sawed off of this, but we'll get into this in just a minute. But then that would physically take the track power to the other side. That's a physical connection for the track power to get from the wheels to the motor. Now, in later days, when we talk about DCC ready, that means we have wires that are separating everything from, so on this particular motor here, we have a wire that runs from the bottom of the motor, which is the negative lead, and then there's a clip on that circuit board that acts as the plus lead. And what they're saying is that it's basically isolated from the track. There's other cases where we've seen some old motors that I don't have an example here, but some of the old Riverosi motors where they would have the terminals on the top and one of them would have a wire. Well, the other one, the wire was actually physically attached to the casing of the motor and would be soldered to that motor terminal. And if you didn't know what you were looking for, it would be you wouldn't think it was something that you needed to cut or isolate. And so the reason we want to do this is because we want to have the decoder itself control everything. So we're putting the decoder in between the track pickup, which is your signal, and then to the motor, to the lights, to the speaker. Everything's going through this decoder because this is going to be the brains of the model. This is what's going to determine how the decoder or how the model behaves, because this is interpreting the signal and then sending the power out to the appropriate place using the different colored wires. Now, when we look at DCC ready models, you're going to see a lot of small circuit boards that you're going to see installed in these. And I've got a handful of different types of circuit boards that you're going to see in a whole lot of different types of models. This one's one of my favorite. This one looks like it's a science project experiment from 1985, but this was removed out of a model that was DCC ready. And you can see there's an NMRA 8-pin plug right there. I mean, that was to flash the lights. So if you do, you know, so this can be very intimidating, but you take it out and you've got your wires where they need to go. And these are just different examples of different circuit boards that you can find inside the model. And basically all those are there to route the power from the track to the motor or to the lights. And a lot of times, and unfortunately I couldn't find one beforehand, but some of the Athearn models, the early versions of their DCC ready, had what they called their DCC quick plug. And the DCC quick plug basically, here I'll make this real quick, had a 9-wire harness that would come off of their circuit board, and then this little dummy jumper board. And this was basically connecting track power to the motors, and then these diodes were making the lights directional based on the polarity of the DC power. So to make this one ready for a decoder, you simply unplug that small little jumper board, and now you had a 9-pin harness that you can take a TSU 2200 or one of our motor decoders and simply plug it in, and now you have a DCC decoder installed in your locomotive. Now, Ken, I know you and I did one not too long ago where we did a 21-pin installation. Yep. We did that live here. And basically that's using this type of circuit board that's, you know, and installed inside the Athearn models. And it just has the 21-pin interface. And basically you take a decoder and you simply plug it in, and now you've got the decoder installation done. And so there's different types of that, but basically the term DCC ready means that the track power is isolated from the motor. It doesn't mean that necessarily that you have a plug ready to go. I know most of these examples that I had here are circuit boards taken out of diesels, but the same can be said for a steam locomotive, where you typically will have a circuit board inside the tender where all those wires are going to. And it's the same kind of concept where those track powers, for example, I know you sell a lot of the Bachmann products, and a lot of their Spectrum stuff had a 2-pin connector going from the locomotive to tender, and those were your track power leads. And then you had a 4-pin connector that was mounted next to it, and that 4-pin connector had 2 leads for the motor and 2 leads for the headlight. And so that's how they isolated it. And internally in that tender, those wires were then routed to the circuit board that had that 8-pin plug. Now, most of these circuit boards have an NMRA 8-pin plug. You can kind of see in that situation. And what that allows you to do is to take for example, our TSU 2200, we can purchase this separate adapter harness, which is a 9-pin, let me move my fingers here. It's a 9-pin to NMRA 8-pin adapter harness that we can then simply plug the decoder into like that. And then if I was to have this model, then we just note the orientation. You see there's a big triangle there. That typically means pin 1 or pin 8. So be sure to refer to the documentation. In this case, it's pin 1. So then I just orient my circuit board. And whoops, I got a bent pin. Bear with me a second.
And just to chime in while you're putting that installed, one of our questions that we did get in is the YouTube channel. So both George Soundtraxx and I have our own YouTube channels. As George mentioned, you could see our previous demonstrations either at Soundtraxx, which has their own YouTube channel. I believe it's youtube.com/Soundtraxx.
Soundtraxx videos.
Soundtraxx videos, and then also TrainWorldTV. So both of them have Soundtraxx videos where you can find more information. So good question, Joe. Thank you. And the Stephen Moore, we will get to your question about picking out decoders a little later. So stay tuned.
Yep, we've got that. So this is how simple it is to use the 8-pin plug. And then now you've got track power, motor leads, and headlight backup light all wired through that 8-pin plug. So it's pretty straightforward, and that's kind of what it is. what it can take to install a decoder. Now, let's, for argument's sake, say we have one of these Athearn RTR models that, like I said, it's kind of dissected right now, but let's say we we have one of these models that we want to make DCC ready. Well, the first thing we're going to want to do is take the motor out. And on the underside of the motor, I'm going to remove these mounts here for a minute. On the underside of the motor, you see that brass metal clip. And in this case, it has a wire. But if you had the old versions, this clip on the underside would just simply be physically touching the frame. There would be two little teeth that would then touch the frame. And then that's how track power was done. Well, in order to isolate that, what we're going to do, I'm going to grab a small screwdriver here. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to carefully remove this tab or this clip. Now, the reason I say carefully is because underneath this clip is a spring with the motor brush. So this clip simply comes off. And here's the, you can kind of see that spring sticking out of the underside. And then there's actually a motor brush that you can see that just fell out of the motor. And these are important parts because these are mandatory to keep this motor operating. So when you're taking that clip off, you want to make sure that you don't lose that spring in that motor or that motor brush. But what we're going to do is essentially kind of like what this piece here is doing is we're just going to solder a wire to it. But you also want to take those teeth off. So you may want to need to smooth this out. Usually if I'm doing this, I'll solder a wire on the inside of this part of this clip. And then in the inside of the frame, you can take some tape, electrical tape or something like that, and just kind of lay it in the bottom there. And that kind of gives you a physical barrier other than the air gap that we're now creating. And then once you solder the wire to your clip, you could do that. You can go back and install that back. And you just want to make sure it hooks around the edge. And then the front part just snaps in place. And now you've got your motor connected. It's going to be important to make sure you do one side at a time. Oops, I'm off center. You're going to want to do one side at a time because this is also the clip that keeps the motor halves together. So if you take both of these off, your motor could fall apart in your hand. So you want to be careful when you're doing that. But once you run these wires from the top of the truck or from the top of the motor and the bottom of the motor, the next thing you want to do is look at track power from the wheels. Now on this truck here, you can kind of see there's a metal bracket here in the center of the truck. And that's what physically touches the frame to transfer that track power to the frame. Well, what I did in this case was I took this truck apart and soldered a wire to the side of that metal tab, that metal plate right there. These are steel plates and some of the old Athearn ones, so it takes a little bit of extra work to get it on there because you need to get it hot for that solder to melt. And that's part of why you want to take the truck apart to make sure any plastic parts that potentially could be damaged are removed away from it, especially things like the side frame. But you just basically take a wire on each side of this truck, and that way you've got your positive and your negative. And then when you turn around and go to the other side, you just want to make sure that your positive and negative wires match up because the front truck is different from the rear truck. So just make sure you pay attention to track polarity. But when you're making a decoder or when you're making this model DCC ready or to isolate all this, these are some of the things you may do. Each model is going to vary a little bit differently. And kind of case in point here, you're going to see a similar situation, but it looks a little different. This is an Atlas U23B that I'm working on in some various state. And you can see here's your track power leads. These are your motor leads right here. And then these are your front truck power leads. And so you're going to see a very similar setup in a lot of your diesels when you're doing these installations. And then once you get to that point, you're going to take one of our, this is our TSU P&P. And this will just simply, in many cases, just simply mount right on top of the, now I'm doing this live, so I'm having trouble getting it snapped in place. But it just usually just snaps right in on top of the motor mounts here. And
no pressure, George.
no pressure. There we go. And it just snaps into place. And now you can see that decoder is mounted securely, firmly, and there's actually a small little air gap underneath to make sure that nothing's touching and nothing's shorting. And then you just take your wires and you attach them to the appropriate terminals on the decoder itself. And each of these decoders, when you buy the packaging, I'm going to grab one of these here for the PNP, and we're going to get into more discussion here about this in a minute. But each one of these documents that comes with it has some basic information that you're going to find. And inside this trifold bag header, it's going to be kind of difficult to see, but you can kind of see there's a wiring diagram. And that'll show you where all the wires that you've just isolated and where they're all supposed to go. But like I said, every model is going to have a similar situation like that. I always like physical barriers when it comes to isolating my motor. I mean, this is another one here that I did. This one here I did years ago. So this is one of the older ones. You can see where those teeth were cut out on the bottom of this motor clip. And this is one that I soldered the gray wire to. And then this would just run up right next to the motherboard here, or to the motor, and then wire up to the decoder. So, but you're going to find all kinds of different situations. This is an old Athearn SW1500, and I say old, it's one of the early RTR versions. But this was a truck that I had gotten because I was changing out the type of truck side frame that was on it. But you can see that they've changed and redesigned how that truck fits so that now your track power leads are these two terminals sitting up here at the top, and this whole truck mounts into the body of the model differently. So you can find a lot of that situation where if you just look closely at it, you know what you're looking for. You can easily find where and how to isolate your decoder. Now, once you have the decoder in place, we've got it mounted here in this case with the tabs. You can use double stick foam tape or anything like that. The biggest thing is just make sure that it's non-conductive. There was a customer in Australia that had a model where he was installing a decoder, and the tape that he was using, actually the adhesive had conductive properties, and so he was having problems with power being routed. I don't know of any of those type of tapes here in the United States, but you know, it could be. So just be careful. The one I typically use, you can get at the Walmart. It's a 3M double stick foam tape. And I use that in a lot of my personal installations, whether it be on top of one of these type of motors, or if I'm mounting it up in the inside of the body shell. For example, on this sound card decoder installation, you can kind of see a similar situation here where you've got the double stick foam tape there at the top. And that's all that it is holding it in place. But the decoder installation is going to be similar. I mean, this case here, this is a sound car, and you can see that you've got two wires from the trucks and then two wires to the speaker. There's no motor, and so all that goes into the decoder here as well. Some of the other aspects we want to talk about is something called a current keeper, and this is a stay alive module that we have that will give your decoder power for up to 10 seconds after track power is lost. So if you have a yard ladder or particularly difficult section of the track where, say, we'll blame it on one of those other club members who didn't do the wiring properly, but have some dead spots or something like that. And this gives your decoder power to run and power through that without hesitation or stopping. I will say all of our newer decoders, all the Tsunami 2 and Econami, all have provisions to add a current keeper, whether that's a 2-pin connector like you see on this PNP, which is this connector right here, or there's some wires in some cases, or solder points that you can solder into. Now, our motor decoder line wasn't designed with it in mind, but we do have provisions for it. We can help share that information with you. But that's one thing. Now, the last part of the decoder installation is, what do I do with the speaker? How do I mount a speaker? And that's always going to be the biggest challenge when it comes to any decoder installation, because a lot of these models, let's go back to even some of the old lifelike Proto 2000 models where every ounce of space inside that model was dedicated to weight. And so then you're left with, okay, well, how can I make space for the speaker? Well, in some cases, you may actually have to remove the weight and cut it up. Basically plan ahead and kind of think about what you're doing. Part of the thing here, you'll see that this has the front weight on it, but it doesn't have the rear weight because I forgot to grab it, but it's in the process of being cut. But that way, what I did was I basically cut it down so that on top of it, I have room to put speakers. So it'll look similar to this one, but on the back as well. And so some cases you may need to do that. Now, one of the other things is we want to talk about is every speaker does need a baffle. Now, really quickly, the way a speaker works is by moving air pressure. That diaphragm is suspended in a cone and it moves back and forth and creates air pressure waves. Well, when those air pressure waves are designed to go out this way, they're also creating a negative air pressure wave on the back. And so what happens is if that air is open and the air pressures are able to mix, you're basically going to lose a lot of the quality of the audio, especially the low frequency, which is what's so difficult for us to get out of our small speakers in our models. And so what you really want to do is you want to have some form of a baffle. Now, this is a 20 millimeter speaker here that we have a baffle on it. And this is our 20 millimeter baffle kit that you can put together and just simply snap it together. And you can do two different thicknesses. So depending on the space available, you can do different types of speaker enclosures, based on what you're doing. You can also put together multiples. This was one, it's a 14 millimeter round speaker, but we put two baffle kits together to give it more of a barrel tube. And in some cases in HO, this fit right there on top of the motor and on top of the gearbox and still give you plenty of decent volume. One of the things that's becoming a lot more popular is our mini cube speakers. And I forgot to grab one here, but I don't have them, but they do come with a baffle already. And so you can simply take those cube speakers and mount them up into the model. A lot of times they're so small that they don't take up a lot of room. Your cutting is either minimal or non-existent, depending on the design of the model.
That's pretty convenient, George.
Yeah. Now, the one thing, and this will kind of lead us into our next topping point, is when it comes to speakers, you want to look at the power rating of the speaker. And the power rating is how much power that speaker is able to handle coming from the decoder. So like say, for example, these 20 millimeter round speakers are rated at 1 watt max. Some of our decoders that we have, like the PNP decoder we talked about earlier, are actually putting out up to 2 watts. And so what can happen is you can overdrive the speaker. And so that's part of why you see these two speakers wired together, is because this is done in a series so that the two speakers are now able to dissipate that 2 watts of power coming from the decoder. If you overdrive your speaker, you can damage the voice coil, which is the actual activator magnet inside the speaker. And if that gets damaged, it can potentially then consequently damage your amplifier in the decoder. So George, you want to pay attention.
George, just to sneak in a question for Lynette.
Sure.
2 questions. Do you have to add resistors for LEDs, or are they already mounted on the board?
That's a great question, and you're right. I did kind of gloss over that. My apologies. When we're doing our decoder installation for LEDs, you will need to add a resistor. I typically will use 1,000 ohm resistor for most of my headlights. And if I'm doing things like number boards or class lights, something like that, I'll tend to use a higher value because I can get that light a little bit dimmer when I'm using the CVs on the Tsunami 2 to adjust it. Now, to kind of speak similar to that point is on our TSU PNP decoder. Remember, for years, Athearn had used these 1.5 volt light bulbs, and there's some other companies out there that had used them as well, but they used the 1.5 volt. Now, using the math to calculate a resistor value for light bulb is a lot more difficult than doing it for an LED. LEDs are current sensitive, and so the resistor that we're putting in there is more to limit the current. So it's a lot easier to put one value and be done with it no matter what your track voltage is. So like say, for example, if I'm operating at 13 volts at home, but then I go to the club at 16 volts, that 1,000 ohm resistor is going to be more than enough to handle the power so that my LED doesn't burn out. But a light bulb, on the other hand, is more voltage sensitive. So what will happen is, especially with these small 1.5 volt light bulbs, if you calculate your resistor value based on your 13 volt track, well, now I go to the club with 16 volts, that light bulb is now absorbing 3 more volts, which is more than 2 times what it's originally rated for. And it'll turn it extremely bright and potentially turn it into a very effective but short-lived flash generator. And so what we did on this TSU PNP is we actually have a pre-regulated 1.5 volt terminal that you can see right there that I'm pointing to, that this will replace the voltage common at the ends of the decoder, so that way you can get that 1.5 brilliance for those lights, no matter which layout you're working on, whether it's club or home. Now, to kind of speak to that, I wanted to point out one really quick thing. Now, it's going to maybe difficult to see, but if you look closely at this solder pad right here that I'm pointing to, this has an oval shaped soldering pad. The one next to it is square, and this one is square. And the reason this one is oval shaped, it's going to be this one on this side as well. The reason it's oval shaped is because that's your quick visual reference that is your V plus common on the end of that decoder. So this terminal and this terminal with that oval shaped soldering pad is going to be the plus 14, plus 16 coming out to your lights. And then the other side is going to be essentially your headlight terminal, your backup light terminal, and then your FX 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you can play around with it. One of the things I do love about the Tsunami 2 when it comes to lighting is that we put some CVs in there to adjust brilliance, including a master brilliance. So if you go in, let's say you do your 1,000 ohm resistor for the lights and you still think they're too bright. Well, previous generations, you'd have to take that resistor out, replace it, resolder it in. It becomes a little bit of a pain in the butt. But now you can actually use a CV to adjust the master brilliance. So that headlight, if it turns out too bright, you can use a CV to slightly adjust the brilliance to your personal liking. And then you can go in and adjust the individual brilliances of some of the other lights, like a number board light, a number board light, a class light, or step lights, or whatever else you're doing. We have some of our hyper lights are called constant dim, or on-off brilliance 1 and on-off brilliance 2, and you can adjust the brilliance of that using a CV so that you can have the brilliance without having to play around with a whole bunch of different resistor values. So it makes the installation a lot easier. And George, I know that's a very long-winded answer, but I hope that covered everything.
It's okay. That's why we call you the wizard. And what scale decoders do you sell? Because we're getting a lot of questions on, do you sell it for N scale or for different scales? So
sure. So we actually do sell them for all the different scales. Okay. And so we'll move into our next talking point here really quickly. And what I want to talk about is the different terms that you're going to hear. Amp, I hear, 1 amp, 2 watt, 3 function. What does all this mean? And so let's talk a little bit about it. So when we talk about, first is going to be the biggest one, is going to be your amperage. And what that refers to is what is stall current of your motor. The reason we talk about this is, a typical motor like this will stall out about 1.2 amps. And it's not because we think the gears are going to lock up and it's going to freeze up the motor, which is the common perception. The reason we talk about stall current is because a DCC decoder sends power to the motor differently than our traditional power packs. So when we have a power pack, we turn the voltage up. As the voltage goes up, motor turns faster, train goes faster. Pretty simple. But when you're talking about a decoder, it uses something called PWM, or pulse width modulation. Basically, power to the motor is either on or off, and that's it. As you increase the throttle, the duration of the on time versus the off time becomes longer. So basically, if you imagine it this way, we're modulating or changing the width of the pulse of power to dictate the speed. And so you get a square wave. It looks just like this. And typically when you go from 0 to speed step 1, you're still going to get that 14 volt pulse of power to the motor. But remember, the motor stopped. That's stall current every time. You go from 0 to speed step 1. Now, once the motor starts turning, it becomes a lot more efficient, and so your current draw drops down significantly compared to when it's stopped. And so when you look at that, you want to make sure that the decoder you're buying is actually rated for what your stall current is. Now, on our YouTube video, we actually have a really good in-depth explanation on how to test that using not just a multimeter in amps, but also we can measure the resistance across the motor leads and test it and read it and then plug it into Ohm's law. So there's a short video on how to do all that. But that's one of the first things you're going to look at is what is the stall current of your motor. The next thing we talk about is the power rating. We kind of briefly discussed this when we were talking about the speakers, 1 watt, 2 watt, and even our 4 watt, I'm sorry, a 3 watt amplifier on our 4 amp decoder. So there's a wide range of it. And so you want to make sure that the power handling of your speaker is equal to or above the task that your decoder is rated for. Now you can always turn the volume down. So like say, for example, if you only have room for one of these 20mm round speakers that we talked about earlier, you can turn the volume down, but you have to be careful because every time you go and reset the decoder, your decoder is going to go back up to 3/4 volume, and then now you're pumping more power through those speakers. So you can potentially overdrive them. So that's why we encourage you to check the rating, make sure it's rated for what you are putting the decoder in. Now, the last one we talk about is the number of functions. Now, when we come to our decoders, we have, it's referring to lighting functions. So on our TSU 1100, for example, and we'll get into the individual products here in just a second, but our TSU 1100 decoder, which is our smallest decoder that will fit in N-scale as well, has only 4 lighting functions. The P&P decoder we talked about earlier has 6 lighting functions, and we do have a brand new one that we just announced not too long ago. Ken, I know you have them over at the store. These are the new 8-function versions of the P&P. So we have different lighting outputs, and that's what it's referring to. And when you're looking at the function outputs, you want to make sure that your rating of the outputs is within tolerance. And each of those function outputs is capable of putting out up to 100 milliamps, which is basically 1/10 of an amp. And so if you're doing multiple lights on one circuit, you want to make sure that the different lights that you're doing are not equal to or above the 100 milliamps. And so when you look at those ratings, when you look at our decoder, a lot of these specifications and so forth are placed on the back of the packaging or on the, and there's some highlights of them on some of the front of the packaging. But also, I know you can look at the website listings and you'll be able to see what the ratings of everything are. Plus, we're a phone call or an email away if you do have questions concerning any of that. But so these are the reasons why those are important to pay attention to, is because they're not, we don't think you're going to damage your decoder because your motor seized up. We don't think your models are that poor, because I hear it all the time. Well, I've never stalled my motor, so I measure slipping current. What slipping current is when the wheels are slipping on the rail while your model is sitting still. Your motor's still turning, and so therefore your current draw is lower than what it would be at stall. And so when you're doing your measurements, you want to make sure you do it at stall, because as long as you're below that stall current, you're never going to run into an issue. Years ago, when we were doing the Economy, which had a board similar to the 1100, which is a 1 amp decoder, customer put it into a Kato model. And the Kato HO models have a fantastic drive. Nobody would have thought anything about them overdrawing more than 1 amp. But when we did a stall current test, it was 1.2. We upgraded him to the 2 amp version, and the problems that he was having went away. And so you want to make sure that you pay attention to the ratings. So let's get into Soundtraxx product selection. So first off, I'm going to start off with our flagship, our Tsunami 2 product line. This is our 2-time Model Railroaders Reader's Choice Award winner for favorite sound decoder. Now this first one here is our TSU 1100. This is a 1 amp, 4 function, 1 watt decoder. Now this decoder is small enough to fit into most N-scale locomotives. It's 10.5 millimeters wide by 27 millimeters long. So it's about 1 inch long, and it's about 3/8 of an inch wide. So it should fit into most N-scale. Now you will notice it is a hardwire decoder, so you will need to make the wire connections where they need to go. So once you open up your model and you find out where all the wires are going, you're basically going to solder the wires here. I always recommend shortening them as close as possible. But one thing I will tell you about the connections on our decoder is these harnesses that we talked about earlier. These are just press fit in. So try not to tug on the wires too much, because these especially are really small, fine wires, because of course, using them in smaller scales. So they can pull out if you put excessive tug on the end of the wire. So you want to be careful not to pull on the end of this wire too much. But this one here is an extremely versatile decoder. And like I said, you get them in all of our sound flavors. And the way you pick a decoder, we have them divided up in steam. And this has all of the steam sounds preloaded into the decoder. No downloading necessary. You don't have to go and be a computer expert using software and downloading, or buy an expensive piece of equipment to download files. They're in there. And so basically you're going to take CVs, which are called configuration variables. It allows you to vary or adjust the configuration or setup of a decoder. And so this way, there's 90 whistles pre-programmed into this decoder that you can select from. And so by adjusting a CV value, you can go through and select any of the 90 whistles to play whenever you push that function 2 button on your throttle. You can select the different exhaust chuffs, different bells, different air compressors, things like that. So basically, you can go through and select this decoder to match any steam locomotive that you can pretty much find, including articulateds and 3-cylinder locomotives. And all of it's preloaded into that decoder already. So you just make a couple of CV adjustments and go. One of my favorite aspects of this is that you can also select the type of fuel that's being used. So one of my favorite locomotives, which is this one right here, if I can get my hands to cooperate, is a wood burner. And so when we're running this locomotive, you'll hear the sound of Fireman Fred grabbing wood and throwing it into the wood fire. And when you take on fuel, you'll be able to hear the wood sound. So you really have those options to customize the decoder to behave. Now, when it comes to diesels, our decoders are divided up into 5 flavors. And part of it, the reason is because when you're doing a diesel recording, the memory that takes up for that idle notch 1, notch 2, notch 3, notch 4 loop is a whole lot longer than chuff. So they're divided up into groups by family. So you have EMD, you have EMD2, which is a second collection of EMD prime movers that will give you some of the more unique versions of that, including a 12-cylinder 567 and a 20-cylinder 645. But most of the main ones that you're going to use on probably 75 to 80% of the EMD models are going to be on that original EMD. Now we also have a GE, we have what's called the Alco, and then what I refer to as the land of misfit toys, known as the Baldwin and others. And this is where all the others are basically living. So when it comes to the Galloping Goose, the Whitcomb, there's the Fairbanks Morse, the Baldwins, of course, and there's actually even the GE gas turbine electrics live on that decoder, and the NRE gensets are on that flavor decoder as well. So it's kind of the collection of all the ones that didn't justify part numbers, because I know, Ken, you and I were talking years ago about the number of part numbers that our original Tsunami was. Yep. And so this was how we tried to keep those part numbers under control for yourself. And then last up, which is our lesser known cousin, is the electric decoder. And we do have that available in the TSU 1100 as well. So you have steam, 5 diesel, and electric, all in the TSU 1100, different flavors. So you'll find which board format fits, pick the flavor, and then that'll go into your cart. Now this retails at $132.95. I know, Kenny, you offer a lot of discounts to your customers, so be sure to check the cart at trainworld.com for your final pricing on this, and these are in stock.
And George, anything for Z-Scale? David keeps on asking me every week with the different DCC companies, so we're trying to find something for him.
I will tell you that with Z-Scale, I do have a customer overseas that uses this TSU 1100, but what he does is he installs it into a box car or designates a dummy diesel that will run in that group, and then this decoder can actually fit into some of the Z-Scale stuff. So
Good thinking.
the biggest challenge is going to be the speaker. And our speaker, we do have one of our cube speakers is down to 13 by 9 millimeters, which is extremely small. So you should be able to fit that into a Z-scale boxcar. And at least if nothing else, if it's self-contained, you can pull it behind different locomotives and just change the profile on what it sounds like that particular day.
And you could probably do that on N scale too if it's not big enough or you're having a hard time, because N scale is very small as well. So that's a good thought and philosophy.
Yep. And again, it's a 1 amp stall current. So if you have two motors, then just make sure that the two of them collectively don't stall more than 1 amp. You can run two locomotives off of this one decoder and just run the motors how you need them. And that way you can have a dummy locomotive in the middle with the decoder and the speaker, and then two locomotives, one on each end. But for you N scalers though, stay tuned.
and any trolley sounds?
That's in the electric decoder.
Okay.
So good. Our electric decoder is designed to give you the sounds of a heavy electric locomotive like a GG1 or the big electric heavy Joe, or what do they call them? The little Joes the Milwaukee Road had, and everything in between down to a trolley or a streetcar. One of the unique sounds that we have in our electric decoder is the sounds of the pneumatic doors opening up on a trolley. And you can do the stop request where they have the little cable that you can pull and stop request. So as you're running your trolley around the layout, you can do some of those unique sounds. And that's all embedded in our electric decoder.
All right,
so,
very good.
So all of that, so let's move on to the next one. We've got our TSU 2200. And this is a 2 amp 6 function decoder, so there's 6 lighting control, and then it also has a 2-watt amplifier. So again, this is going to be a very powerful. One of the biggest things we heard in the years past was more sound, more power. So we listened, and so this has a 2-watt amplifier. Now again, this is a universal hardwire style decoder, but like we showed you with this this dummy one here that I have, this harness that's pre-wired into the decoder just simply unplugs so that you can plug in either the 9 to 8 pin adapter harness like we talked about earlier, or you can plug into the 9-wire adapter inside your Athearn RTR. But you do have that versatile plug that's on the end that you can simply unplug. Now this one again is available in all of our formats. You have the steam, the 5 diesel versions, and the electric. And real quickly here, Ken, I want to throw a question out to your viewers and see if we get some good answers. Any of you guys have any idea how many possible sound combinations that I can make in my steam decoder? And I'm going to give you a tip. There's 90 whistles. There's 54 bell recordings. There's 10 exhaust chuffs, 10 air compressors, 8 steam dynamos. You have 4 different types of fuel that can be used. You have 3 coupler sounds, and you have, what am I missing? You have a lifting, non-lifting type injector, articulated versus non-articulated sound, 3-cylinder. So I'll let you guys play with the math on that a little bit and see how close we can get.
I just got lost thinking about how many options you just said.
So, but anyway, but the goal was we wanted to give you one decoder that so if a customer comes over to you, Ken, and says, I need a steam decoder for, you hand them a steam decoder, and everything's built into that one decoder. So with that's the TSU 2200. Retail price on this is $124.95. And Ken, again, I know you offer discounts at the store.
Yeah.
So next up, we're going to talk about our TSU 21P NEM. And this is our 21-pin version decoder of the Tsunami 2. And again, we're going to, talking about the Athearn motherboard here, we can simply plug it in and simply mount it. This is just a dummy. I apparently forgot to grab my 21-pin NEM, but this would plug in. Now, one of the things I want to point out is this 21-pin plug is keyed. And what I mean by that is there's a pin missing on the lower side of this here. And so on the circuit board, usually it's filled in where that pin would go, so that way you can't plug it in incorrectly. And the correct orientation is with the black plastic header on top plugged into the decoder or into the circuit board there, so that way your black plastic header mounts on the top of the circuit board. But this is a really easy, a lot of manufacturers are using this a type of this circuit board. So the good news is you can upgrade those factory installed decoders to a Tsunami 2 with a simple removal of the 21 pin and plug it right in. Now this 21 pin NEM retail price is 109.95, and it is available in all the different board sound files that we talked about: the Steam, EMD, EMD2, GE, Alco, Baldwin, and others, and then the electric as well. And again, Ken, I know you have them in stock and at a discount.
Yeah. All of George's Soundtraxx products, we carry the full line. So you can check our website, TrainWorld.com, and anything Soundtraxx makes, anything that George sells, we carry. No questions asked. So George just says, Ken, this is what you got to carry, and we just carry it.
Hey, and it's been doing really well for you, so that's a good thing. So next up, I'm going to talk about our P&P boards. I've got 2 decoders here because, as I talked about, we have our 6-function version. And then I have our brand new 8-function version. And you can see kind of here along the bottom of the decoder here where you can see where the extra pins or the solder pads have been attached or are located to attach the extra lighting functions. But to talk about this is again a 2 amp for the motor. You have 6 or 8 functions for the lights. This is a 2-watt amplifier built into the decoder. So again, you want to make sure if you're installing a P&P, you want to have 2 of those sugar cube speakers or the mini cube speakers mounted in your model to make sure to dissipate. Now the P&P board is only available in the diesel flavors. So if you're looking at a diesel decoder, this is going to take the place. This is one of the early Atlas boards that were used years and years ago, and you can kind of see the resemblance. And there's a lot of modelers, or let me say that again. There's a lot of model manufacturers over the years that have adopted some form of that circuit board, like we were showing you in with some of these other boards that you're removing. And so once you take that circuit board out of the way, you're going to see its similarities. So you can reuse this P&P. Now, what we've done with the P&P, though, is we've taken most of the mounting provisions by the major manufacturers and accommodated them in one circuit board, whether it be Athearn, Atlas, Bowser, Intermountain, Pato, and others. All the provisions for mounting this circuit board are calculated in. So these holes that you see are going to be designed to match specific mounts of different manufacturers. So again, one-stop shopping, you get the P&P decoder, whether you want a 6-function or an 8-function version, and you simply mount it in. And like I said, worst case, you can use some double stick foam tape on the back side of the decoder. There's some, there are some components, but there's not a lot of major ones. And so you can use some double stick foam tape to mount that decoder in place. Retail price on the 6-function version is $110.95, and then retail price on the 8-function version, the other way around. 6-function version, 8-function version. The 6-function is $110.95. The 8-function is $115.95. And again, these are MSRP pricing. Now, the last one we're going to bring up here is our 4-amp 6-function 3-watt amplifier. This is going to be good for S scale, O scale, and G scale, large scale. And this is going to be the decoder you're looking for. So again, when we talk about covering all scales, we've got everything covered. Now this has a 4-amp stall current. So again, if you have a model that stalls at 4 amps or higher, you may look at either repowering, or in some cases, if you have 2 motors, you can wire those motors in series, and that'll reduce the stall current down quite a bit. So there are some provisions and options. One thing you'll notice here, though, is that you have screw terminals. And so that way you don't have to do the soldering like you did on the other decoders. You can just simply put the wires in the appropriate terminals and screw it down. And these are all labeled on the edge of the decoder so that you can see really quickly what wires are supposed to go in what terminals. So there's RR and LR for right rail, left rail, things like that. So, and again, this one is available in all flavors. So you have steam, the 5 versions of the diesel, and the electric. So Ken, did anybody answer my question? How many possible sound combinations?
It's funny. I was just going to interrupt you, and Andrew actually came up with a figure, and I'm kind of curious if you previously mentioned this on any other episodes, because he came up with an exact figure of 10,880. Now, is that correct?
No.
Whoa. Okay.
2.1 billion.
Oh, wow. Okay. Andrew was way off.
So the way I did this is 90 whistles. I can choose any one of those whistles to combine with any one of those steam exhaust chuffs, combined with any one of those bells recordings, combined with any one of those fuel types. Some of the things I didn't mention was lifting or non-lifting type injector, manual or power reverse. And so each one of those, as you go through the laws of probability, you can increase that each time. So it's basically 90 times 54 times 10 times 10 times 8 times as you work your way through. Because I was talking about that with somebody one time, and we were trying to figure out how many possible combinations. So I actually sat down. Now the qualifier here is I'm not counting volume control. Volume control creates a whole nother possible set of profiles. And I'm also not counting equalizer or reverb settings. These are features built into the decoder that allow you to modify the sound effects. And I'm not counting any of those. I'm just talking strictly sound selection. So if anybody's curious to see the math, shoot me an email at georgeb@soundtraxx.com and I'll be happy to share it with you.
Well, I feel bad for Andrew because if he hit it out of the ballpark, I was actually going to send him a free decoder. So sorry, Andrew, you were just way off.
Well, and we've mentioned it in our advertising and stuff like that, so I wasn't sure if he was. I was hoping maybe he caught one of those.
It seemed like a figure that was reasonable. I thought for sure that it sounded like a good number to me. So close, but no cigar.
Yeah, no worries. So anyway, that kind of covers the boards that are available in our Tsunami 2 product line. And we built that line with all the different formats that are designed to help give you the best installation. So in many cases, you can go through and look at your model and try to see what your best installation option is. If you're not sure, we also do have a decoder selector on our website that'll give you, for example, the Atlas U23B, and it'll give you the decoder and speaker combination we recommend. Then you can go to TrainWorld.com and purchase the decoders. So we do try to give out as much information as you can. Worst case, shoot me an email and I'll help you out. As I mentioned, I've been a modeler since I was 14, so I do know a lot of obscure models and some of the stuff that's out there, and so we might be able to help you. So real quickly, I want to touch briefly on a couple of our other products, and then we can open the floor to some general questions if you have some, or some general back and forth banter. But This is our Economy product. This is our Economy Tsunami, and the Economy word is a play on the sound, on those two words. But basically, it's a budget sound system. Currently, we're only able to build these two formats. We have the P&P board, which is going to, the P&P board, which you're going to see a lot of the same type of selections there, except with our Economy, things are more streamlined. You basically have steam or diesel, and in the diesel P&P, there's 5 different prime movers you can choose from. You have 16 air horns to choose from, and you have some very limited features as well. For example, one of our award-winning features that we love on the Tsunami 2 is the reactive dynamic exhaust. That's not present in the Economy product line. And so again, with our steam version, you have 16 whistles, 4 exhaust chuffs, and you very limited bells and sound selections beyond that. Now, retail price on these are $79.95, so they are affordable. And a lot of the features you're going to find in these Economy decoders are going to be comparable to what you're going to see in a lot of our competitors' high-end stuff. Some of the features in there, for example, one of the things I'll talk about briefly is number of sound channels. And the reason this is important is because the number of sound channels determines the number of sounds that are able to play at the same time. With some of our competitors' stuff, with some of the limited features, when you turn on the bell sound, the air compressor mysteriously disappears because they only have so many channels to play those sounds. Well, their top-end stuff, let me say that again. Their top-end product boasts that they have 10 sound channels. Economy has 12. Tsunami 2 has 16 sound channels. And so all of those sounds can play at the same time. So no longer will you lose your compressor or your bell sound whenever some other sound is being prioritized. So that kind of briefly covers the Economy product line. And then I do want to briefly touch on our mobile decoder line. Now, this is a line of non-sound motor decoders that you can simply, affordable, inexpensive, that you can simply plug in. We do have some N and Z scale versions here that you can see use the 6-pin connector And then you have a wired version of that same decoder. And this one is measured at 9 by 13 millimeters. So they're very small and easy to fit into a lot of those N and Z scale models. So if you have the one sound, you can put a motor decoder into it and another one, and they can run them together. And the prices on these vary. I'll be honest with you, off the top of my head, my brain is going blank, so I don't remember all the retail prices on these, but they're on average about 20 to 25 up to $30 a piece. So be sure to check out the pricing at TrainWorld. We also do have some of the HO versions, and this one here is, I lovingly call this one the postage stamp, but it basically has a postage stamp size, but it's got an integrated 8-pin plug that just simply plugs into the 8-pin socket that you see in most of these HO diesels or steam locomotives. This one's our cheapest, least expensive decoder, but this does give you DCC right out of the package, controls the lights. So you've got basically 1 amp motor, 2 lighting effects, and the 8-pin plug will plug right into it. Then you have the AT style, which again, you're going to notice there's a lot of similarities to this original board that Atlas started using years ago. So I'll give them credit because they were really the first ones to really kind of go mainstream with these circuit boards inside the models. Even predating this, when they had the Kato versions, they had those phosphor bronze wires that ran back and forth through the plastic housing. This is ultimately what replaced it. So that's why you're going to see a lot of these Atlas style. That's what they call them because of that. But this is another one of these. This one has 4 functions, 1 amp motor stall current. Now, these two are going to be very, very similar to each other. They're both essentially the same physical decoder. The difference between these two is one has the NMRA 8-pin plug behind it. The other one is basically the loose, non-terminated wire harness that has no plug on the end of it. So that's basically the difference. This one, you're going to pay a couple of dollars more for it. But if you're going to hardwire it in or replace it, this has the same removable harness that you found in the Tsunami 2200 that we talked about. So if you're just going to plug it into the Athearn 9-pin plug, you can just simply unplug this. If you're going to plug it into the 8-pin socket, there's it is ready to go. And again, these are pre-built up. And then our newest motor decoder line is our 21-pin motor decoder. Again, this one just plugs right into the 21-pin socket right there on your circuit board like we talked about earlier. And these are all available at trainworld.com. So that kind of covers really the decoder product line. Installation on all of these is going to be very similar to the stuff we've talked about throughout the entire time that we've been talking. So I know there's a ton of information. I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts and then we'll open the floor. Our Soundtraxx products are manufactured here in the USA, in Durango, Colorado. Once all this disease stuff lights up and the virus goes away and we're all allowed to start traveling again, you guys are always welcome to come visit our factory and come see a tour. We're proud of what we do, and we do manufacture here, so that is a great thing. But being the fact that we manufacture here, we do go through a thorough, extensive testing procedure. Every single one of our decoders is hand tested, whether it's built for one of us here that we're doing to sell through retailers, or we're building for Athearn to install factory installed in their Genesis models or their RTR models. All of them are factory tested by our technicians downstairs by hand to make sure that decoder works the first time. So when you get it, you can have that confidence in knowing that it's going to work. If you do have any questions, you can contact us, our support department. We do try to do our best to make sure to help you out in every way possible. Including, we don't really advertise it as such, but if you do have a problem with a decoder, let's say, for example, you wired the wires together and the decoder goes poof, we don't advertise it with, but contact us and we'll do our best to take care of you in those situations.
Great stuff, George. And again, all of Soundtraxx products you could get at trainworld.com. George is great. He has been fantastic. And George, also what I see that I love about this hobby, a lot of people are asking questions and a lot of people are also responding. And, you know, so it's a great hobby that a lot of people are so helpful about, and it's great to see. So we really appreciate everyone who's been answering questions. There are some questions, George, if you got a sec, if you want to
Sure.
Pick some people up. But
Sure,
Joshua is saying the motor decoders have CV2, 5, and 6, which are V start, V mid, and V high for easy speed matching. So I think he was just talking to someone on that.
Yep, they all do. And all of our Tsunami 2 and Econami decoders do have that now as well.
Okay, and I think he was responding David's question. So
Okay.
Joshua is on the money. Thanks, Josh.
There you go.
And Chris wants to know if you have any electric sounds, which I think you covered in that oddball decoder.
No, it's in its own unique electric decoder.
Oh, electric decoder.
So all the board formats do have an electric format, electric preloaded sounds, and so in there you get, I believe, I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's 40 air horns. You get 50 different bells to choose from. There is a traction motor sound, and that traction motor sound does have our dynamic exhaust. So when that locomotive is working harder, you're going to hear that traction motor intensify as it's working harder, and then it's going to cut back when you're coasting. And you do have air compressors and things like that to choose from. So whether it's a light electric, a heavy electric locomotive, all the way down to a trolley or streetcar, you're going to be looking at the electric version of the decoder. So if you're modeling the Acela, any of the AEM 7s, the Little Joes, GG1s, all the way down to trolley and streetcar. And here's something I didn't mention, is that with our electric decoder, we actually have a unique lighting effect that's not present in the rest of them, and it's called the arcing light. And I have a YouTube video on it that shows it, where I took a GG1 and mounted an LED up in the pantograph. But as your locomotive is running, you'll get that occasional flash of the arc of the pantograph off of the wire that you'll see when an electric locomotive is running.
And so how about really European cool, electric, George?
I will say that most of the horns on there are domestically based. So air horns would be about the only thing I could think of that might be different. But if you have one in specific, shoot me an email. Let me know what reference you're looking at. But if they don't blow the horn a lot, or you can find a horn that's similar, then I don't see any reason why you couldn't do it.
Gotcha. And Michael has a question. Any thoughts on a 8-function 21-pin TSU coming?
Stay tuned.
Okay, interesting. I don't know how Michael asked that question, but okay. Very
well, because we did just announce the 8-function PNP version.
Ah, okay.
And so it's the natural progression.
Gotcha. I was gonna say, George, are you not telling me something?
No, I just haven't had anything to tell yet.
Gotcha. And Lynette has another good question. When wiring one of the decoders in a passenger car, are you hooking up just the track pickups and speaker wires?
Yes, essentially, yes. The cool thing about a passenger car is, if you want to go the extra step, if you're using our sound card decoder, which I didn't really cover in our decoders here, but our sound card decoder creates the sound of the motion, you clickety clack, flange squeal, brake squeal, things like that. But you also do have 4 lighting outputs. So if you want to light up the interior of that passenger car, go ahead. I actually have one of our demos. I don't have it here in front of me, but one of the trade show demos that I've taken around, I actually have a sleeper, and I took 3 of the compartments and individually lit them up, so I can turn the function buttons on and light up 3 of the individual compartments. So when that train is running around the layout, you'll actually see that passenger car lit up unevenly, which is a really cool effect. But you can do, but essentially, yes, all you'd have to do is the track wire and the speaker.
Very good. All right, George. Well, I thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. You're a wealth of knowledge, just really great amount of stuff learning here. So we really appreciate it. And again, you could get all your Soundtraxx products at TrainWorld.com. George puts up these great videos, so please check them out. You could either go to the Soundtraxx YouTube page or the TrainWorld YouTube page. So we really appreciate it. And thank you so much, George. Have a great night, everybody, and we'll keep in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Appreciate it. And if you guys have any further questions, feel free to email me, georgeb@soundtraxx.com, and I'll try to get to everybody's questions.
Sounds good. You're going to regret that, George.
Hey, you know what? Like you said, this is one of the greatest hobbies in the world, and the friendship and the camaraderie that we've developed over the years in this hobby is fantastic. And like I said I will try to get to everybody's question. I will get to them. It just may not be immediately, but I will get back to answering your questions. Just let me know you saw me on the Facebook Live with Kenny, so that way we'll make sure we get to answer your questions.
The most humble man in the industry, George. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.